This paper, titled The Shaman and Schizophrenia, which is open access and therefore accessible for anyone to read, seems to provide a modern, living example of the bicameral mind. And so it presents very strong evidence for this theory, or at least some of the major components of this theory. This is fascinating in its own right, which is why my last video examined the example of shamanism presented in the paper, which involved shamanism as it exists in the country of Ghana, and compared it with the ancient bicameral mind in order to note the remarkable similarities. However, the paper also offers an interesting perspective on how shamanism could indicate that there might be a better way to help people who suffer from schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia often suffer a lot. Their subjective experience of the world is utterly at variance with the way the world is perceived by neurotypical people, and so they often don't fit in with broader society. They are often misunderstood and marginalized from society, and experience high rates of poverty, homelessness, and are very often the victims of violence or abuse. Treating schizophrenia is often difficult, but in the West, it usually involves an attempt to make the patient more similar to normal people. But this paper questions whether all of this is really necessary. And it posits the possibility that the reason why people with schizophrenia suffer so much is because they are born into a society which does not accommodate the way their mentality works, and which also treats their mental experience as inherently abnormal and pathological. In Ghana, people who hear voices aren't considered unusual. Instead, they are recognized as potential shamans who need to be in the right kind of environment in order to make use of their mystical abilities. So accordingly, they learn about the different gods, identify their voices with particular gods, and they are taught how to listen to these voices in order to receive the knowledge which the gods possess. This gives the voices more form and structure, so that the voices are actually useful rather than being harmful and maladaptive. Remember, these voices ultimately come from different parts of the person's psyche. And so training someone to actively listen to these voices, in this case in a religious context, allows them to access different parts of their mind. The fact that people with schizophrenia can become shamans in Ghana means that there is a place for them in society, rather than being marginalized or outcast. As the paper notes, first, practice as an okomfo offers someone an identity that does not pathologize their experience. When the person falls ill, they are able to interpret not only the voices, but the social disorientation of their first psychotic episode as being comprehensible and normal, within a specific context, from the very beginning of their experience. The problem with the way we treat schizophrenia in the West is that the second someone admits that they're hearing voices, we give them this weird look and tell them that this is a sign of severe mental illness. We diagnose them with schizophrenia and then insist that they need to be returned to normalcy. This label of schizophrenia is very stigmatizing, and it's likely that for the rest of this person's life, regardless of whether or not they recover, people will treat them differently just because of this one word which has become associated with severe mental instability. The paper notes that this can have dire consequences. Increasingly, psychiatric scientists suggest that the very early identification of voice hearing as a sign of madness is extremely costly for those with psychosis in the West, that this identification provides a toxic identity from which the patient never fully recovers. The label of okomfo not only provides a way to avoid this toxic identity, but allows the afflicted person to reinterpret the judgments of other people in a thoroughgoing manner. So in parts of Ghana, instead of being told that there is something wrong with them, those who hear voices are designated as shamans, and they are trained to be functional members of their society. Their experiences are normalized rather than pathologized. They are trained to see the voices as something positive. And this actually seems to affect the way that the voices behave, since it nurtures a more positive relationship with them, rendering them friendlier and in alliance with the person's ego rather than hostile to it. I often get this question asked in the comments of my videos, that if the voices of the bicameral mind were so helpful, how come the voices I hear are so hostile, abusive, and disorganized? And for a while I didn't have a good answer. But this paper suggests that if you tell a person that the voices they hear are harmful, this is exactly what they will become. Because right away, the patient sees the voices as a sign of illness, and may try to push them away, which leaves these voices underdeveloped or even hostile to the person who's trying to repress them. I mean, if you were a complex in somebody's mind, wouldn't you also rebel against the person trying to push you to the back of their mind? That's probably one of the weirdest questions I've ever asked. But anyways, this paper hints that shamanism gives us a better way to go about helping people with schizophrenia without rendering them dysfunctional burdens on society. In social worlds where there is an identity in which hearing voices is normal, and practices which teach people how to distance themselves from negative voices and develop relationships with positive voices, the work of culture may allow some people with schizophrenia-like experiences to experience less severe illness and function effectively in the world. More evidence for this point comes from the fact that there are recent emerging treatment methods for schizophrenia which aim to nurture a positive understanding and positive relationship with one's auditory hallucinations. As the paper notes, there is evidence that social practices may alter the experience of hearing distressing voices. There are new, still relatively unusual, and seemingly radical approaches to voice hearing among persons with schizophrenia, mostly based in Europe, most famously hearing voices groups. These approaches teach people not to fear their voices, and to develop a relationship with their dominant voice. In effect, to place the voice within a social relationship with the person who hears, with the expectation that the voice will behave as if it is indeed within a social relationship and be more responsive and more engaged with the human who hears. Given everything I know about schizophrenia from Carl Jung, Julian Jaynes, amongst others, this is the way that I have attempted to help one of my clients who suffers from schizophrenia. Rather than telling her to ignore the voices and instead focus on reality, whatever that means, I encourage her to listen to these voices to try and understand what parts of her mind they could represent. There was one instance where a hallucination, which in this case was auditory and visual, showed up during one of our sessions. And instead of becoming scared, I took this as an opportunity to interact with her voices and treat them seriously, asking this hallucination if it would like to weigh in on the conversation, as though the hallucination had a legitimate right to be heard. This approach has been surprisingly successful, and my client is doing much better now. Now, you might be wondering how it is that we can make people who hear voices more functional given our secular society. For shamanism, this is pretty straightforward, but our modern religions don't usually employ shamans, and many people are turning towards irreligion. Well, if you have any ideas about how to go about this, please share them in the comments. But one idea I had is that it's possible to make use of the power of the unconscious mind through people who experience these hallucinations. Because the unconscious mind is an immense source of insight and creativity. Albert Einstein famously came up with his best ideas whenever they spontaneously arose from his unconscious mind with no conscious input whatsoever. So why not educate people with schizophrenia with all sorts of notions and ideas and allow their unconscious mind to weave these ideas and develop new insights from them? We can leverage the power of the unconscious mind in those individuals whose unconscious mind is more accessible to them. This could make them more functional in society, and I think that a society which can utilize such people and utilize their talents in this way may have a great edge over societies that just kind of marginalize people with schizophrenia and, throw them into asylums. Anyways, I'm going to leave the discussion there, but just as a reminder, I am currently accepting new clients for psychotherapy. So if that's something you're interested in, please email me. My email will be in the description below. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.